On Tuesday, 5th August 1890, Mary Ann Innes died at the Newton Hotel in Kirriemuir in Angus. Her death raised suspicion, and eventually her husband, John Webster, stood trial for her murder. At the beginning of August, Mary Ann began to feel unwell. She suffered from vomiting and was thirsty all the time. Over the next few days, she grew worse, and local physician Dr. George Clark was called. He believed she was suffering from gastroenteritis. Normally known as a healthy woman, it came as a shock when she died. Her husband claimed that she died of Scotch cholera, caused by eating new potatoes and fresh vegetables, but something was just not quite right, and many became suspicious that he may have had a hand in her death. He showed no signs of being upset when she died, and his behaviour at her funeral was said to be callous. 38-year-old Webster was for many years a business manager and treasurer of the Dundee Theatre, and in the early summer of 1890 purchased the hotel in Kirriemuir for just over £1,900. In October the previous year, he and his wife took out joint insurance policies to be paid on their deaths, but only 2 half-yearly premiums had been paid. When he tried to put in a claim for the £1,000, the insurance company suspected there was more to this case than met the eye, so refused to pay up. Mary Ann was exhumed on 27th November, and tests were carried out. It was found she'd consumed a vast quantity of arsenic. Webster was arrested on 4th December on suspicion of her murder. On Saturday, 17th January 1891, one of the witnesses called to the trial of Webster was found dead. James Peacock was a barman at the Newton Hotel and was one of the principal witnesses for the Crown. With his absence from the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh on the Friday, it led to the postponement, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. Search parties were sent out to scour the district, but without success. On the Saturday afternoon at the Wilkie's Linen Works, water was run off their pond, with the result that Peacock's body was discovered. There was much speculation in Kirriemuir and the surrounding area when he was found, but foul play was ruled out. Finally, on Tuesday, 17th February, Webster's trial resumed before the Lord Justice Clerk, John MacDonald, Lord Kingsborough, on a charge of poisoning Mary Ann. There had been interest in the case from the start, but it was intensified by Peacock's suicide. Long before the commencement of the trial, the courtroom was crowded, a large number of those present being women, as well as a number of young advocates. The prisoner, who was described as a respectable-looking man, told the court he was not guilty. Helen Rose Grant, a servant at the hotel, was the first of over 60 witnesses called. She said that Mrs. Webster first fell ill on Friday, 1st August. She vomited twice that day. On the Saturday, Mrs. Webster continued to be ill, vomiting frequently, and being unable to retain any food. On the Sunday, Webster said his wife was not very right, but she wouldn't hear of a doctor being called. He did, however, send for Dr. Clark on the Sunday evening. Mary Ann vomited every hour on the Sunday and gradually got worse till she died on the Tuesday. During her illness, only Webster, their daughter Lizzie, and Grant entered her bedroom. David Peacock, James's brother, stated that Peacock had committed suicide by drowning on the day before, the 14th of January, the day previously fixed for the trial. Frederick Johnson, law clerk in Kirriemuir, said he was in the Newton Hotel on 11th January when Peacock asked him what would happen if he changed his statement at the trial from the one given. He explained that he remembered seeing Mrs. Webster vomiting, while he'd stated to the authorities he'd never done so. 10-year-old Lizzie Webster, whose appearance in the witness box greatly affected her father, said that during her mother's illness she didn't take her any food. Dr. Clark stated to the court that Mrs. Webster was suffering from excessive vomiting. She complained of stomach pains and was very thirsty, with no appetite. He prohibited the use of stimulants which had been given to her. No explanation was given as the cause of her illness. In the evening, when he visited Mary Ann a second time, she was senseless, and he was surprised at the change in her condition. He ordered hot applications to her feet and powders, and the next day heard that she was dead. That evening, Webster came to him for the death certificate, and the doctor certified gastritis as the cause of death. In her testimony, Mrs. Webster, Mary Ann's mother-in-law, said that as far as she knew, her son and his wife had lived happily together after they moved to Kirriemuir. She said she'd had conversations with Mary Ann about an illness she'd had. The deceased said that if the medicine she got didn't do her any good, she'd have to go through an operation. The prisoner had been a good son to her, she stated. Jessie Webster, his sister, stated that her brother lived happily with his wife. She also told the court she'd stayed with Mary Ann at Kirriemuir, and on 2 occasions, Mary Ann became ill and vomited. There was nothing in her meals to account for her vomiting. There were several medicine bottles in the dead woman's bedroom, she claimed. She also implied Mary Ann had sought to be sterilised to prevent her from having any more children, as she'd lost 3, although 2 survived. Moreover, the Webster women and the servant called Nellie all insinuated Mary Ann had been unfaithful to Webster and that she'd been promiscuous. However, in letters Mary Ann had written, it was clear she felt her in-laws were a bad influence on her husband, and when she moved to the Newton Hotel, was no longer on speaking terms with them. It also transpired Webster had tried to throw her out of her home in Dundee, and on one occasion she went back to stay with her parents. She only went back to him when he threatened to take her away, her 2 surviving children. She also suspected he was unfaithful. At the trial, Mrs. Webster spoke of her son's habits and attributed his sexually transmitted infections to his wife and her alleged affairs. Dr. Steele Moon said Webster consulted him regarding the infections, which he did agree Webster had told him he'd gotten from his wife. Moon had treated him, and Webster recovered. However, Mary Ann was said to have been faithful, so how did she get the diseases? Agnes Scott, who worked at the theatre in Dundee, said Webster had sexually harassed her regularly when she came to light his fire in the mornings. This got back to Mary Ann, who was utterly distraught. She also found out he'd taken a liking to Mrs. Jackson, Kate Martin, who collected the tickets for the expensive boxes. Her husband had deserted her, and Webster helped her find a solicitor to help her with her divorce, his own. He received copies of the documents and was listed on the itemised bill as having attended appointments with her. Lizzie Webster later told her mother that Webster had bought a new photograph album which contained 2 photos of Jackson. Jackson denied having a relationship with Webster, claiming she got her divorce to marry someone else. Professor Fraser of Edinburgh said he'd examined the dead woman's kidneys, and the symptoms indicated a form of Bright's disease. She also had an unusually large uterus. In a person with that condition, arsenic would be a natural remedy. During proceedings, glass jars with parts of Mary Ann's body were held up for those in the court to see. It was a gruesome sight. Dr. Howden, superintendent of Montrose Asylum, also took the stand and stated that Mary Ann's mother was confined for some time at that institution. She'd suffered from melancholia and exhibited suicidal tendencies. The implication was that Mary Ann suffered the same. Dr. Bruce was also called as a witness. He told the court that for a person of Mrs. Webster's condition, he concurred with Howden regarding the arsenic. So could Mary Ann have administered the arsenic herself? The defence, led by Mr. Asher, Webster's counsel, believed so. They claimed she'd taken Fowler's solution, which contained small quantities of arsenic and was used for gynecological conditions. The Webster women also claimed she had taken it, but her doctors who treated her final illness and dealt with her during her pregnancies had never prescribed it. It was never proved she'd taken any, and no evidence was found at her home. She would have had to have taken at least 2 tablespoons to account for the amount of arsenic found in her stomach. Following summations, the case was closed, and the judge directed the jury to look at the evidence. They returned to court at 5:30 in the afternoon, after an absence of less than 10 minutes, with the verdict. In the silence, the clerk asked what that verdict was. The foreman said, "The jury unanimously find the prisoner not guilty." The Crown simply couldn't prove Webster had poisoned his wife, and he was discharged. There was cheering from the public gallery as he was acquitted. In one of the side rooms, Webster was reunited with his relieved family. Following his acquittal, Webster and Jackson went on to get married in Glasgow. The day before, they boarded a ship and emigrated to Canada. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.